One of the things I feel like many of us can sympathize with, if not outright understand, is the idea of having to pay for something we've done. And I'm not just talking about criminal acts, I'm talking about mistakes, errors in judgment, coincidences, things that we not only feel guilty for ourselves, but others also harbor negative feelings towards us for. And I think the real question that needs to be asked with regards to that is, how far are we willing to go to make it up to them? We're going to start this episode talking about something a little bit interesting, at least to me. First and foremost, every single one of the Star Treks has had several similar type character archetypes, right? There's the captain. That's kind of an obvious one. There's the royal smart person, as several people have talked about it. And there's the engineer, and there's occasionally a doctor, and so forth and so on, right? There's usually a security person. You get where I'm going with this, right? One of the things, though, that Star Trek has always tried to do is try to make those characters different in some way. Obviously, probably the single most powerful way they've pulled that off is with the captains. All of the captains, yes, even Archer, do have a fairly distinct personality, approach, mindset, etc. from each other. Whether that's a good or a bad thing. But one of the ones I've always found interesting is the engineers. Let's look at Scotty for a moment. Scotty is, without question, the improvisational engineer. The guy who can make it work pretty much no matter what. He's the kind of guy who was pretty much perfectly suited towards the Enterprise, the old Enterprise, because they were on the frontier. They were doing things in what was effectively the edge of the unknown. Worked really well there. Let's talk about Geordi LaForge. Geordi was the design engineer, the architectural engineer, what most people would actually refer to as an engineer. The kind of guy who should actually be building new ships and new engines and designing them and that kind of a thing. That also suited him quite well, being in the next generation. We're exploring known space. We've passed the hurdle of the frontier. Space is now more understood. Everything is now more commonplace. So that kind of a thing makes more sense there. Then let's look at O'Brien over on Deep Space Nine. Now, O'Brien is kind of a mix between the two, but ultimately, if I were to define Brian, I would say he is the worker engineer. He's the guy who gets in there, gets his hands dirty, and manages to just barely keep things together with twine and a little bit of tinfoil, which perfectly suit Deep Space Nine and the unusual nature of the very thing they were on to begin with, and the many, many unusual situations they were faced with. Here's where the problem comes in. When the creators of this show, way back when Voyager was first being pitched, were designing the character of B'Elanna Torres, there were three big things they made for her character. One was the conflict between her Klingon and her human side. Okay, fair enough. I think they did a decent job with that, all things considered. Two was her inability to emotionally connect with anyone else. Again, I think they actually did a good job with that, although I put most of that to Roxanne Dawson, who does an excellent job of portraying the character, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. And three, they wanted her to be O'Brien. They wanted her to be that kind of engineer, because she was the Maquis engineer. And everything I just said about O'Brien kind of fits that perfectly, if you really think about it. Obviously, they couldn't do that, or rather, they felt like they couldn't. I would like to go out on a limb and say that I think actually they could have done that. Just my opinion. And by the way, this is not extrapolation. This is, I always have to make that clear. This is actually admitted by the interviews and the behind scenes information from the making of the show. They felt like they couldn't repeat O'Brien, at least in terms of engineering skill, even though B'Elanna Torres is a very different type of character from O'Brien, the everyman versus the person who doesn't fit anywhere. They felt like they couldn't repeat that engineering style, so they had no idea what to do with her. And that's one of the reasons why when I get down to trying to define her engineering style, I kind of failed because she didn't really have one. Now, later on, they started to work her into sort of a theoretical engineer, someone who was really good at, putting stuff together in her head and then, working with a team to make that happen because she wasn't a very hands-on engineer. In other words, kind of a leader engineer, of all things. But that was later on, and that was done after the fact. I hate to speak negatively of Voyager again, but ultimately, this is just kind of what the show did with everyone, with the exception of the Doctor, and that's it. When they started Voyager, they had no planned character arcs with anybody. I'll talk about this more later, but in another video, I mean. Let's go ahead and talk about this episode just a little bit here. So that's the engineer thing. Let's talk about B'Elanna Torres just a little bit. And let's stop talking about B'Elanna Torres, because I'd actually like to save that for later. Sorry. What I would like to talk about is the Alpha Quadrant. Season 2 kind of intentionally, kind of didn't, kept calling back facets and aspects and things from the Alpha Quadrant. I say kind of deliberate, but it mostly wasn't deliberate. What mostly happened was that was just the kind of story that everyone picked up on at this point in time, although the stories that were being pitched to them. The idea was, any given one of these episodes, if you look at them, actually it kind of fits fine on its own right. The idea that something else from the Alpha Quadrant could end up in the Delta Quadrant by whatever means is not that unusual. But unfortunately, because it kept happening over and over in Season 2, even starting with the first episode, the 37s, it just kind of became a little bit ridiculous how each episode like, and now let's see what else we find from the Alpha Quadrant out here. And this is a trend that would kind of continue in the future, although fortunately they dialed it down a lot. Season 2 is pretty much the worst batch of this. I just thought I'd mention that because, well, and I've actually got a note down here, but I want to talk about this right now. The Dreadnought, that the title is named for, gets pulled away to the Delta Quadrant, and then spends a year and a half or more. We don't actually know the specific time, unless I want to figure out the star dates, and who wants to do that? A year and a half at least, just kind of warping across the Delta Quadrant, and then, oh, I want to target that thing right there because it fits the target parameters, kinda. I think it's telling that when the Cardassian computer comes back online, it instantly recognizes that there's a problem with its targeting. I just felt like pointing that out. Moving on. Yes, I know you could argue why, but it's just interesting to me. I wonder if I want to talk about that now or later. Let's talk about this now, okay? We'll tie this point up at the end of this video, but one of the things I've said many, many, many times, especially with regards to Star Trek, which can be a little ridiculous at times, is if you have a ridiculous premise, I can go with you on it if you're going to do something with it. And that's the important part. Do something with it. If you have some ridiculous, ludicrous story, I'm okay with that as long as you actually make it mean something. I prefer a well-constructed, sense-making story, but I understand that that's not always possible or feasible, and I'm with it. And that's all I'm going to say about that matter. Let's talk about LeVar Burton really quick. I was just talking about Geordi, so that seems appropriate. LeVar Burton is a really well-accomplished director. Decent actor, all things considered. I've never seen him in anything I didn't like in, but admittedly he hasn't been in that many things. But he is a very good director. He knows what his stuff, and this episode is a testament to that. I challenge you while you're watching this episode, and as I'm talking about it, just try to literally watch the directing style. He has a very distinct style to him, and it's very interesting what he tries to do. He does things with lighting. He does things with camera movements. He does things with, flow. There's a great deal of flow to the way he will present a scene where, as the camera is moving this way and it's panning across the characters will, be doing something, and in some way, not as obvious as I'm doing right now, just kind of looking to the right as the camera is moving to the right. Or maybe they'll like twitch in that direction or something like that. Little stuff like that. He does that a lot. He does a good job of it. Excellent director, so bravo, Burton. Let's go ahead and talk about bad exposition. Let me take a moment to say that I can't believe I'm doing this again, but this is another episode where reading too much into it on the part of both the director, LeVar Burton, and the actress, Roxanne Dawson, was done. This is something that is verified, through interviews and whatnot like that. So we know that they were reading too much into the script. And it makes sense because the script is kind of mundane or bad. If you actually just sit down and read the lines, take everything else out from it, it's just like, what is this? A good example of this is right at the beginning of the episode, where we have a a textbook example of bad exposition. And it's even worse because it's in a scene that's trying to be comedic and failing at it. So we have bad comedy mixed with bad exposition. Now you're probably wondering what I'm talking about. Bad exposition is when I tell you something, when I tell the character here, Blue Wall, that something that Blue Wall already knows in order to get it to you, the viewer. That is pretty much textbook bad exposition. It's probably the worst, when I say a full dissertation of, well, blah 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 blah, as you know, blah 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 blah, That's just terrible. But it's also bad when it's like this, which is a very simple thing. In this case, it's just the Doctor saying, well, as you know, I don't think he actually said as you know, but either way, as you know, I have a great deal of experience in choosing names. Yes, we do know that, Doctor, and in fact, her very next line is asking you how your search is going because she's been involved with you in this search for the names before. Most of the crew has by now, for God's sakes. It's just a little thing, but it was like it's like stepping on a thumbtack while you're walking on the foot. Yeah, it's a little thing, but it's like, it just killed the scene, and then it tried to be funny. Oh, yes, I like these names, but I would never like this name. And let me tell you about how all your names are retarded in some way or another. Very funny. You could tell when you're watching that scene that poor Picardo just was watching that. He was performing that. He had no interest in it. He was just like, yeah, whatever. Let's just get this scene over with. All right, I'm done with that. I swear. Ignoring the retardation of that whole scene, which frankly you could just clunk and fling out the window, the rest of the teaser's actually really good. They come across some debris. It's been destroyed. They're worried about it because of the level of armor that it was, and oh my god, that's incredible. Well, let's go analyze it. What is it? It was me. Da da da. Teaser. That's a good teaser. I like that. Caught the attention. Got the interest. And I like the way that Dawson portrays her one line. It was me. It's not just a, bum 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 moment, but there's this hint of guilt in her performance, and I'll just talk about that more in just a little bit. But let's move on. One of the other things I like is the Tom subplot kept going in this episode. Now, the Tom subplot, if you'll remember, has been going on since. I actually don't remember. It's been going on for several episodes now. And it's always just a little thing. Tom misbehaving in some way, or Tom kind of being, just this loser kind of not really fitting in character, right? Two scenes really do that justice. One, he shows up to the briefing late, and I love this because no one acknowledges it or anything, not until the end of the meeting. Good, that was exactly what should have happened. He just walks in and is like, oh, I'm sorry, and then sits down and, oh, yeah, okay. They didn't even need the end of it. If I was doing this episode, I would actually cut the last part where Chakotay calls him out on it. I know there's reasons for that to happen, but from a viewer's perspective, we don't need to see that. We can understand. In fact, you could have just said, what I would have done instead is have Chakotay just kind of give Tom a look and say, Tom, a moment, and and he walks off camera, and then we know what's going to happen because Chakotay's going to chew him out. We don't need to see that. It's just two little things that shows the viewer something's up here. The next scene is a wonderful scene, and it's this scene, I mean this sincerely, I feel like this scene is the reason why the Paris and B'Elanna relationship really started to become a thing in the minds of the creators and the writers, because the chemistry between the two actors is really amazing. I talked about this before, way back in Caretaker, about how a surprising amount of chemistry and working together, and how all the actors just really got along really well, and it really shows. And I felt like that's one of the reasons Voyager got the shot it did. This scene is really a grade A example of that. The two actors are just going right through it, just acting with each other, and there's a great deal of flow to it. There's a great deal of I don't have a good word for it, but it fits. It's like seeing two people who actually get along talking with each other despite everything. And in that scene, in addition to being an exploration of that, we also see more about B'Elanna Torres, and we see more about Tom Paris, sort of. The Tom Paris stuff is only really available in hindsight. And this is kind of a spoiler for later on, so if you don't want to hear this, tough. But in all seriousness, it's a spoiler from like 2 episodes from now. We find out later that Tom Paris has been faking it this whole time, okay? That he has been faking this whole thing. I'm not going to go into why. That's not the point. The point is, in this episode, we see just how much Tom is dedicated. And that's the word I'm going to use, because we see this throughout the whole series. Tom Paris is a man who is very dedicated to whatever it is he cares about or believes in. And he believed in doing this job right for his own reasons. And so this is a great example of that. Even with someone he was close to and considered a friend, like the chief engineer, he still was putting up the farce for her, and he was still doing it in full plain view of everyone else. Really, really well done there. On top of that, as I said, we learned more about B'Elanna Torres. Again, I give props to the actress because this was her reading into her character a great deal more. Obviously, the point in the dialogue is, I did this and therefore this is my responsibility. If you read the lines, that's really how it comes across. The way she read the lines was, I feel guilty, not just because of the incident with Chakotay, but because this was me when I wasn't thinking ahead. This is me when I wasn't thinking about the consequences. This is me when I was being reckless, when I was being unreliable, And as a resultant, we see that guilt, we see that self-condemnation come across much better in her character, and it helps explain some of the things at the end of the episode, which I'll get to later. There's the year thing. We'll talk about Michael Jonas for a bit, because I want to talk about the Dreadnought in its own section. The Michael Jonas plot again rears its head, and he just kind of starts talking with random guy B because they didn't have enough money to get Seska. Seska was actually originally supposed to be the person he was talking to. They didn't have enough money for it, so they had some random Kazon guy give him the runaround. And all I gotta say about Michael Jonas in this episode, because he only has the one scene, two really, but only one scene that is to him. The actor who plays him, whose name I cannot pronounce and I don't remember fully, I apologize. He was in Knights of the Old Republic, just to give you an example. Carthonasi, he played Carthonasi. He's actually a really good actor. He was in 24 as well. A few other things. He's a good guy. But I gotta give him credit because the scene is just really flat and kind of boring. It's literally just him telling the Kazon, we found this weapon, it's amazing, let me talk to Seska about it. And the Kazon guy saying, screw you, and screw you, respectively. Not really an interesting scene, but the thing that's interesting is his performance. He portrays someone who is simultaneously... He portrays a specific type of nervousness, and it's the nervousness of someone who believes they're doing the right thing, and they're forcing themselves to do it, even though they don't like what they're doing. You understand what I mean by that? It's hard to summarize that by one word. He genuinely believes he is doing the right thing and betraying the crew to Seska and all this fun stuff. And you can see that in his performance, but he doesn't like what he is doing in order to accomplish that, and you can see that in his performance too. So, definite thumbs up on that one. Voyager's reputation. Speaking of the Kazon, the fact that this is actually the second time this has come up just makes me want to facepalm, Back in Cold Fire, we saw a big old thing about how Voyager had this reputation as a ship of death, and how it was, renowned as being this horrible bringer of doom across the Delta Quadrant, right? And that made sense, because if you take the actions that the Voyager crew did out of context, which is what happens with word of mouth and just rumor and that kind of thing, yeah, Voyager should have a terrible reputation. They did, just to name one thing, they did deal with the Vidians here, and let the Vidians go. You remember that? Their very first encounter with them? Just to name one example right off the top of my head. Voyager should have this horrible reputation, and yet the two times it's been brought up, in Cold Fire and in here, it's lies. In this episode, they go out of their way, and it feels so out of place. They actually go out of their way to have a line about how the Kazon have been spreading word and rumor in order to make sure no one allies with us, because they're the Kazon. Screw you and screw you is actually their formal foreign policy, if I'm not mistaken. So, just wasted potential. That's all I'm going to say about that. I do want to talk about one other thing about with regards to the... I wrote their name down because I can remember. Rakosians. That's it, the Rakosians. The Rakosian actor wasn't exactly bad. I don't even remember who it is off the top of my head, but I gotta give some credit where credit is due. His scenes between him and Kate Mulgrew were actually pretty good. It was just Captain Janeway trying to reach someone who has no reason to trust her, and demonstrate through action that she was on his side. And I kind of like that. And there's 3 scenes of that. There's the initial, there's the one on the comm, and then there's the second one on the comm. And all of those are actually well done. And she has a wonderful line, which, forgive me for misquoting a bit, because I don't remember the exact wording, but it's basically, sacrifice my life to save 2 million? That's not a hard choice. And I like that because that's what Janeway should be. And, well, yeah. We're not going to go into that. So, let's go ahead and move on to... we'll talk about that in a little bit, because we're going to kind of lead into this. Let's talk about when B'Elanna first goes over. She goes over to the Dreadnought, tricks it into, fixing its navigation systems, shutting everything down. She beams off. Job well done. Let's talk about how we're going to salvage this sucker. I understand why they didn't do things this way, but I feel it's worth noting that I think it would have been interesting if they'd kept going with that line. What if she actually had beaten the Dreadnought right then and there? What if that really was the end of it? Wouldn't it be interesting then to see the consequences of that action, rather than exploring? I know. What they actually do is they explore B'Elanna Torres as a character, and that's good. I like that. But I feel like it would have been more interesting from a writing perspective, to explore the ramifications of this event. You could still explore B'Elanna Torres. After all, she is still guilt-ridden over this issue. And it's not actually laid to rest so much as she got lucky this time, and I think it would be emphasized to her in character. This is my rewriting section, by the way. It's a little bit early. Emphasized to her in character. You got lucky this time. What's going to happen next time? That kind of a thing. Have Chakotay mention how he's put it to past and put it to rest and all that stuff, but have the actor portray the fact. Have Robert Beltran portray the fact that it isn't. That he actually still feels hurt. However many years later, about the fact that she didn't trust him that one time, and she wounded him that one time, Have an examination of the fact that Voyager calls up this alien species and says, by the way, this massive missile is coming towards you, just an FYI. Oh, it's okay, though, we stopped it. Wouldn't it be interesting if that actually made their reputation worse rather than better? If you think about it from their perspective, that is really fishy. What if they sent their ships out anyways? What if they tried to destroy the Dreadnought? And what if Voyager wouldn't let them because they wanted it for salvage? You see where I'm going with this? There's so much else you could have done with the story rather than Techni Sue. Let's go ahead and talk about Techni Sue, finally. The Dreadnought, the actual ship, is without question a Mary Sue character. I know that phrase is bandied about a lot, and I know a lot of people have different definitions of that. I myself tend to think only more extreme examples of that type of character can actually be qualified as a Mary Sue. This is probably one of the most extreme examples I've seen for a while, and will be until we get to another episode, which I believe is in this season. In which case, well, I don't want to spoil it, but let's just say that Voyager writers tend to like Mary Sue characters. Janeway herself actually becomes a Mary Sue character more than once, I might add. This ship is Techni Sue in every way, shape, and form. It defeats everything they do. It's super advanced. It tricks B'Elanna. It can destroy ships at will. It can analyze and adapt to their weapons instantly. They're just constantly bandying about how incredible this ship is and how it is so much better than them anyway. Please think about that for a second. Please think about the fact that the Cardassians made this. Let's start with that, okay? No offense to the Cardassians, but they are not well known for their advanced technology. I mean, I could point to Deep Space Nine itself, the station, or I could point to their ships, which are comparably equipped for smaller Federation equivalent ships. Or I could point to the fact that their government is a mess. Even before the events of Deep Space Nine, their government was a garbage heap of corruption and inefficiency and negligence. And these people built what is effectively the Borg 1.0. Oh, by the way, fun little side fact: the model they used for the Dreadnought was actually repurposed to make the long. I don't even remember what they call it. The Borg ship that they use later on, the elongated kind. Not the sphere, not the cube. The dinky thing. The Borg probe, basically. Just felt like pointing that because this practically is a Borg ship. You could almost rewrite this episode as the thing being a Borg ship. And as far as a technical standpoint, it would actually make a lot more sense than some frickin' Cardassian bomb. And that's the best part. I hadn't even reached that yet. It's this super advanced ship, except it's not. It's actually just a bomb. It's a bomb with engines and a computer core. In the episode, we find out that this super incredible advanced ship actually didn't go off properly. It beat all the Maquis defenses, and then the detonation trigger failed. Now that I bought. That I was totally with. Yeah, okay, that's very Cardassian. Now I know what some of you are going to say in defense of this episode. Oh, well, B'Elanna made it into the super weapon. No. B'Elanna repurposed the programming and the core. And that's it. Everything else about this ship was all because the Cardassians had made it the super weapon of doom. Which, by the way, was working for, again, at least a year and a half, without issue. The one thing that two, I'm sorry, there are two things that failed on the ship. One was its targeting computer, and the other was the fact that it still had the Cardassian program on it. That's it. Ugh. I apologize. This is the part I could go on. I could go into the logistics of how ridiculously stupid this thing is. I really could. From a military standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a technological standpoint, from a setting, from just a viewing the episode standpoint. This whole episode made you just want to go, yeah, right. And it is ridiculous. And that brings me into the part that I really want to talk about. B'Elanna Torres. I'm going to go and put this away because I'm basically at the end game here. First and foremost, I'd like to say that I almost feel that it's a shame that B'Elanna didn't get to think her way out of the situation, but I understand why. I'm not going to complain about it. Because what I like about this is B'Elanna Torres does think her way out of the situation. And it does so in service of the character. Let me explain a little bit what I mean. I feel like this section of the episode had a bit of a rewrite because everything else about the Dreadnought just screams technobabble. Really, it does. They just randomly throw out words and the Dreadnought adapts and moves on. It's like I said, it's ridiculous. But this one section is great because there is no technobabble involved at all. The way she solves the problem is she finds an old Cardassian program that's still in there, the old operating system, basically. Fires it up. The two operating systems start going at it completely. It's a great scene, by the way. It is an absolutely phenomenal scene. As Roxanne, I don't know why I keep wanting to call her Rachel. Roxanne Dawson has this wonderful expression on her face that just changes as it's going on. And I mention this because keep in mind, the actress has no audio for that scene. She is acting basically in a vacuum. So she has to, at the right times, show the right expression for what's going on. So definite props to her and LeVar Burton, both of them who really coordinated on this episode. But the other thing I love about this scene, the editing job done for the two voices talking at each other and then eventually over each other until it's just this giant garbled mesh, was really well done, and it really got across the point of that scene. It was phenomenal. I loved it. And then that was her plan, so she outthought the computer, but outthinking it wasn't enough, because she felt like that would at the best be a way to disable it or stun it, I guess is a good way to put this for a little bit. But that allows her to get access to the core. She gets into the core, pulls out her phaser, and she's ready to go. And I like that, because that is a very B'Elanna Torres way to solve this situation. I have the power to end this myself right now, and I'm willing to die for it. And yet, before you go thinking that's a little bit too noble of her or whatever, do keep in mind that based on my interpretation of B'Elanna Torres, and especially the way she's portrayed in this episode, I don't think dying was actually something she was considering. Not really. I think it's more her approach to a problem, her approach to a situation. This is a problem. It's my problem. I caused this. I made this mistake, and I want to own up for it. So I'm going to stay here and see it through regardless. If you get the difference here, there's a difference between I am willing to die for my cause and I am willing to do whatever it takes for my cause. There's a difference in mentality there, and the latter is B'Elanna Torres. Brilliant examination of the character as she's lying there with the phaser shooting at it on her back, and you could see in her face as she's gasping for air because the life support's been cut off. Her portrayal of that determination was phenomenal, and I loved it. And then, of course, they win. The end, game over. It ends so suddenly. It's like, okay, we did it, and then it's over because you feel like they were going over their runtime or something, But that's it. That's basically all I have to talk about. I could go over details about how I don't think it's funny that they forgot about the Doctor, because it wasn't. I could go over details about how I think that Janeway willing to destroy the ship in order to stop the Dreadnought is both ridiculous and actually really appropriate and in character. Simultaneously, I know it's weird. I could go over how I think that the conversations they have, where they talk about how people were in a mass panic and they were all trying to evacuate the East Continent, which is where the Dreadnought was going to hit, and try to get off in time, and they couldn't make it, and there's rioting and horribleness, and there's just not enough room on the ships. That was good. That was good to give us a face on it. And if I can describe why for just a moment, within a TV budget, you can't really show something like that. Not really. Unless you're really lucky or you really plan for it or something like that, you can't actually show that kind of a situation. So having him talk about it, even though it feels a little bit cheap, was still a good move, I think, and still emphasized the point. Especially since that emphasizes the point of why Janeway was so willing to go so far to make this happen. And that's the final point I'm going to make. Janeway and B'Elanna's actions are basically identical in this episode. Janeway is willing to do whatever it takes to accomplish her goal. She's not going into this saying, I am ready to die. That's not her mentality. She is willing to do whatever it takes, sacrifice her ship, all their way home. All of that was just pushed aside. She wasn't even thinking about it. This is the problem, and I'm willing to go the limit. I'm willing to go the distance in order to stop this problem. And I think that's an excellent portrayal of this episode. So, hands off to actually making a good episode. It would have been hard to... This episode, I mentioned back that one of the reasons I kept watching Voyager was because of Meld. That was a partial truth, because this episode is the other reason. Meld followed immediately by Dreadnought. Even though at the time I was just face-palming at how stupid the Dreadnought thing was, they still tried to do something with it. And I think they succeeded. So, definite props. And I'll see you on the next episode.